Before I hand it over, there it is. Before I hand it over to Heather in a minute, I'm going to let you know about a few other upcoming events you might want to check out. There will be a fry bread cooking demonstration and tasting with Anishinaabe Mejim on Sunday, June 28th at 4 p.m. here downstairs. So you should definitely come because fry bread is delicious. And Heather will also be back here on Tuesday, June 30th at 6:30 for a lecture called Freedom for Who? Indigenous Nations and the American Revolution. So that will also be very interesting. And before I turn it over to Heather, I will read our land acknowledgement. So the library board recently approved the library's land acknowledgement, which is as follows. The Ann Arbor District Library acknowledges that it benefits from the colonization of indigenous lands. The library pledges to support indigenous peoples and cultures through partnership with and, wow, this light is messing up. Pledges to support indigenous peoples and culture through partnership with and recognition of Anishinaabe artists, writers, teachers, and performers. Please visit aadl.org/land for more information about this land acknowledgement. And now I'm so excited to welcome Heather. Heather Bruegl, inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, quickly developed a passion for Native American history. Curiosity for her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she researched the history of Native American tribes of that region. She is a graduate of Madonna University of Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in the U.S. History, and she currently travels and lectures on Native American history, including policy and activism, and she is a PhD student at UW Green Bay. So please welcome Heather.
Right. Hi, everyone. Super glad you could come out. I know traffic was a little insane. I was driving in from Dearborn, and I didn't think it was going to be that bad, but it was. So I'm glad you made it. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you guys about some really cool stuff tonight. We know that this is an important year, right? We're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the United States on July 4th. 1776, the United States declared independence for Great Britain. And so I'll be talking about that more in other talks throughout this year. But this one I think is really interesting. This is actually a series of talks that I do where I kind of break down different events in U.S. history, but tell you from an Indigenous perspective about them and, like, you know, Indigenous events. So this one, we're going to go back to the very beginning, like 1100, and we're going to come all the way to 1860. So it's a lot of information to cover in a short amount of time. So I will leave time for questions. I'm going to watch my time very carefully to make sure that we are able to answer a lot of questions if we have some. But I really hope that throughout this talk, you look at events in history, maybe that you learned about in school, but maybe you think about them a little differently now, or maybe events that you didn't learn about, and you gain some new information. So I'm really excited to bring this to you guys tonight. So again, my name is Heather. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work as a historian, a consultant. My day job, I'm a curator at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation in Dearborn. I'm a researcher. I'm a doctoral student. I don't sleep, so it's totally fine. There's my contact information on the screen. If you think of a question later, please shoot me an email, Sometimes we think about things afterwards, and we're like, oh, I should have asked that. But here you can have a way to contact me. So you can follow me on social, or you can just shoot me an email. Marissa already did it, but just we wanted to acknowledge the land that we are on. And if we think about Michigan and Southeast Michigan in general, I want to add the Miami, Wyandotte, and Fox Nations to those as well. But I also want to point out that today those nations are in parts of Canada, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and other parts of Michigan. They still exist. Their seats of government are now elsewhere, and I want to make sure that that is part of that acknowledgement, because I think sometimes it's easy to look at Indigenous people as things of the past. When we're here, we're present, we're part of the conversation today. So the first thing I want to talk to you about in this timeline is the Haudenosaunee, which I am part of, the people of the Longhouse. The Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, as you may have learned about it in school, and both you can say Haudenosaunee, you can say Iroquois Confederacy. You're not wrong in either one. But Haudenosaunee is the word in the language, so it means people of the Longhouse. And they're believed to have been founded in around 1142 by the Great Peacemaker, and it's said to have happened after a great solar eclipse. The Confederacy was formed by both men and women. The Great Law of Peace was law that was written on wampum belts that was handed down by the Great Peacemaker and spoken by Hiawatha. The original Confederacy was referred to as the Five Nations because there were 5 nations that were part of that. That would have been the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. In 1722, though, the Tuscarora, who called North Carolina home, migrated north, and they joined the Confederacy. And for nearly 200 years, this Confederacy was powerful in policy making. So if you aligned yourself with them, whether you were a European colonist or settler or another tribal nation, that was great power in that. The Confederacy was matrilineal, which is probably something that when settlers first heard about that, they were like, what are you talking about? So basically, the clan mothers had great power, and this was hard for settlers to understand because it was women in the tribes who made decisions. They were held on equal footing as the men. During the French and Indian War, the Confederacy remained mostly neutral, but they were really, really good at playing the French off the British. So think about, like, if you asked your mom for something and she said no, and then you went and asked your dad for something, and so they would go back and forth. So kind of that happened a lot. They would play the French off the British to see who they would could receive better trade goods from. But then something happens, and we'll talk about this more a little later on. Something happens in 1783, and the Confederacy disbands. So what happens? The American Revolution happens, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. There's a signing of separate treaties. The U.S. signed treaties with the Tuscarora and the Oneida. Those remaining in New York were forced to cede their territorial lands. However, since the Tuscarora and the Oneida helped in the Revolution, which if you come to the talk at the end of this month, you'll learn more about, they were given larger tracts of land and money for education. The Mohawk, though, signed a treaty with the British. They received a land grant in Canada and formed their own confederacy. So there was a big rift, right? For over 200 years, this group of tribal nations functioned under the Great Law of Peace. And then there was a breaking up of the Confederacy. But eventually, the Confederacy does come back together later on. And we'll talk more about that at the end of this month when we go a little bit more into detail on the tribe's roles in the American Revolution. Jumping forward in the timeline, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. So when I was in 4th grade, we lived in North Carolina, in Charlotte for my dad's job. And I think that was the first time I learned about, we had like North Carolina history class, like in Michigan here, you have Michigan history class. North Carolina, we had North Carolina history class, and it was the first time I learned about the Lost Colony of Roanoke. And I became obsessed. I was like, I'm going to be the historian when I grow up that is going to figure this out. Y'all, I still don't know where they're at. Like, it's insane. But there has been a lot of talk about them. But it is fascinating. It's one of those mysteries that we're still not quite sure what went on. So the colony at Roanoke, which is also known as the Lost Colony, was the first attempt at a permanent settlement in a British colony in the New World. It was established in 1585 on Roanoke Island, which is in present-day Dare County, North Carolina. On March 25th, 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh to begin colonizing the New World. A group came and explored the land and came into contact with different tribal nations while they were there, including the Croatan tribe. Not everything was rosy, and at one point the settlers accused the indigenous people of stealing a silver cup, and in retaliation set fire to their village. Despite all that was going on, Sir Richard Grenville decided to leave the colony, promising to return April of 1586 with more men and fresh supplies. But April of 1586 came and went, and there was no return of Grenville. In June of 1586, there was an attack on the fort at Roanoke by local tribal nations. Shortly after this attack, Sir Francis Drake was on his way back from a successful trip to the Caribbean. He stopped by the colony on his way back to England and offered to take the colonists back. Several accepted this offer and helped to introduce tobacco, corn, and potatoes to England. Grenville arrived back at the colony shortly after Drake left and gathered most of his men and headed back to England. He left behind about 15 men to continue to have a British presence. Jumping forward to 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh dispatched a band of new colonists, around 115, to settle in the Chesapeake Bay area. Led by John White, once the group arrived, they were ordered to go over to Roanoke and bring back the people that were there. Once at the settlement, though, they didn't find anything. Simon Fernandez, who was the lead navigator on this trip, refused to let the colonists leave and determined to start a colony at Roanoke. John White reestablished relations with the local tribal nations. The colony at this point is starting to run low on supplies, so they persuaded White to return back to England to get supplies and ask for help. He leaves behind 115 colonists, so 115 people, including his daughter, newly born granddaughter, Virginia Dare, who was the first English child to be born in the New World. New World. I put that in quotes because the world was already here. So, White left for England in late 1587 with plans to return, but then there was this whole thing with the Spanish Armada that happened, so he was late in coming back. He finally makes it back after 3 years. So 3 years goes by, and he finally makes it back. And he lands August 18th, 1590, on what would be his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. But the settlement is deserted. There's nobody there. There's no sign of the 115 colonists, no signs of a struggle, no signs of a battle. The word Croton is carved into a fence post around the village. The homes were dismantled, which meant that people didn't leave in a hurry. So they weren't just like torn down, right? They weren't like destroyed. They were dismantled piece by piece. Before White had originally left, he instructed the colony to carve a Maltese cross into a tree if their absence had been forced. There was no cross found. The word Croatan was carved into a tree, so White took this as maybe they moved to Croatan Island, which is now Hatteras Island. But there was a storm coming and his men refused to search anymore. And the next day they left without ever finding out what happened to the colonists. It wasn't until 12 years later when Sir Walter Raleigh decided to investigate what happened to his colonists. In 1602, Raleigh and his new crew headed to North Carolina, but Raleigh also wanted to make money on this voyage, and by the time he and his men were done gathering plants they could sell, the weather had turned bad and they had to leave. In 1603, there was one final expedition to find out what happened to the colony, this time led by Bartholomew Gilbert, since Raleigh was already in prison for treason, because there was a lot going on in England at this time. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, but bad weather forced them to land elsewhere. But once they'd just begun the search, Gilbert and his group were killed. It's said in 1607, John Smith learned that Chief Powhatan, father of Pocahontas, was responsible for the slaughter of the colony at Roanoke. This was also confirmed by a second source who was at the Jamestown colony as secretary, William Strachey. His report claims that the colony had been living peacefully with the indigenous people just outside of Powhatan's territory for more than 20 years before they were slaughtered. These reports have proved the traditional view that the colony was slaughtered. However, there was never any evidence found of this. Now, also giving chance that there's a lot of time that's passed, so where would the evidence be? Plus, upon further examination, the slaughter may actually have been of the original 15 colonists that were left behind, not the 115 that came as the second colony. To this day, nobody's been able to find out what's happened to the colony. There have been theories, but there isn't any actual evidence that swings the decision either way. In the back of my mind, I think that one day maybe I'm going to find out what happened. Chances are I'm probably not going to find out what happened, and it's going to be one of those mysteries that will never be solved. But it is something that's interesting, and that's part of this timeline that leads to the founding of the United States. And it's another thing in the timeline of Indigenous history. Just like the founding of Jamestown, which does end up being the first permanent settlement in the New World. Landfall was made April 26, 1607, near the Powhatan River, which is later named the James River in honor of King James. There is a whole group that comes in. The reason they pick this area where they're settled is it wasn't inhabited by indigenous folks. So they thought, right? There's nobody living here, so we're just going to take up land here and it's going to be fine. But they arrived too late to plant crops. Many of the men actually didn't know how to farm, as they were English nobility. So why would they know how to farm? In just a few months of the settlement, 80% of the colony had died, and others ran off to the native nations in the area. The Powhatan Confederacy ruled this area. They had settlements along the area that numbered somewhere around 14,000. They consisted of 30 tribes. Chief Powhatan was their leader, and they were an Algonquin-speaking tribal nation. Another example of Algonquin language would be the Lenape language or the Mohican language. That's another example of Algonquin. And don't ask me, I don't know any of the words. I've tried to learn my indigenous languages, and they don't stick for some reason. Maybe if I was taught as a child, they probably would have stick better, but as an adult, I just don't get them. Their territory extended from present-day Washington, D.C., near the Potomac River, to the Albemarle Sound in South Carolina. And at first, they welcomed the colonists with dancing, feasts, tobacco ceremonies. But then they became a little weary of the colonists. They didn't leave. Their numbers got bigger. More people were coming. The first winter that the colony was there was rough, but Powhatan didn't let the colony starve. Many of his people, including his 10-year-old daughter, Pocahontas, took the colony's corn, fish, and wild game. The gifts were misunderstood by the colonists, and they were unappreciated. The colonists believed that the indigenous people were paying tribute to the superiority of the Europeans. One of the colonists, George Percy, said that when the rations were dwindling down and they weren't going to be able to survive, the food from the natives saved them. He also thanked God who, quote, put the terror in the savages' hearts to save the Europeans. It's also during this time that Pocahontas is kidnapped. She's held on a ship. It's also the same time where John Smith embellishes the story of him and Pocahontas. That makes it all the way back to Queen Anne, and it's probably the most popular story that people know about, even depicted in a Disney movie. But I have a whole other talk about how that story is false and wrong. In 1619, the English built a school for native children to teach them Christianity. One could argue that this is the beginning of the boarding school system for indigenous people within the United States. By 1620, there are over 1,000 colonists in Jamestown, and they asserted their superiority over the indigenous peoples and laid claim to the land. So we go from Jamestown to Plymouth Rock. Anybody ever been to Plymouth Rock? It was highly disappointing. It was so small. My husband and I, a couple years ago, when we lived in upstate New York, we were like, let's drive across America. So we started at Plymouth Rock and drove all the way to Seaside, Oregon. And when I say we drove, he did. He drove. I drove for maybe an hour because I don't like to drive. But I got to Plymouth Rock and I go up to it and I'm like, sit. It was kind of the same feeling I had when I went to Mount Rushmore the first time. I was like, it's really small. It's not as impressive as I thought it was. But that's just me. I saw this thing on social media the other day about how in our minds Plymouth Rock is like this cliff overlooking the ocean and people landed upon it. And that's how it was in my head until I saw it. And sometimes it still is in my head that way. until I think about this tiny, small rock that I saw. That on December 21st, 1620, pilgrims landed there, right on the Mayflower, landed in Plymouth Harbor. They settled in what was an abandoned settlement of the Wampanoag Confederacy that had been devastated by a series of plagues, by diseases that were coming in, and it virtually wiped that settlement out. The first formal contact that the Pilgrims had with indigenous people in the area came on March 16th, 1621, when Samoset, who was an Abenaki, walked into their settlement and proclaimed in perfect English, "Welcome, Englishmen." The Abenaki are an Algonquin-speaking tribal nation that call the areas of New England and Quebec home. They are one of 5 tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, people of the Dawn land. During the visit, they learned that the leaders in the area were those of the Wampanoag tribes and that Massasoit was one of their chiefs. They also learned of a man named Squanto, who was virtually the sole survival of one of the plagues that hit one of the villages. Samoset stayed into the night in the settlement and agreed to arrange a meeting between the Pilgrims and his leaders, but Massasoit and Squanto were cautious of the Pilgrims. They didn't quite trust them. Massasoit's first encounter with the English, several of his men had been killed. And in the case of Squanto, he'd been kidnapped and spent 5 years in England. So of course, there was reasons to be alarmed around English people. On March 22nd, Samoset returned to the settlement with a delegation of 60 warriors from Massasoit that included Squanto. And Massasoit himself would later join the delegations. He and the Pilgrims negotiated a peace agreement, and Squanto acted as a translator. Gifts were exchanged with the Pilgrims, giving Massasoit a pair of knives, a copper chain, biscuits, and, quote, a pot of strong water. Liquor, booze. In the peace agreement, both sides promised not to hurt each other, but instead help each other if either were ever hit by a third-party attack. After the peace agreement was made, at the urging of Massasoit, Squanto acted as a diplomat, a translator, and an educator. He taught the colonies how to farm in the area, fish, and how to gather supplies, and where to go to get said supplies. In October of 1621, Massasoit invited the Pilgrims to join in a Wampanoag harvest ceremony. This is sometimes thought of as the first Thanksgiving. But the first Thanksgiving really has its origins in the Pequot Wars and King Philip's War. So the Pequot Wars was an armed conflict that ended up taking place between colonists in New England who were settled at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Saybrook and their allies, and the Narragansett and Mohegan nations on one side. So you've got the settlements at Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Saybrook, and their allies, including their indigenous allies who were the Narragansett and Mohegan, not Mohican, Mohegan nations. And then on the other side, you had the Pequots. There was a series of events that would eventually lead to war in 1637. Beginning in the early 1630s, conflicts were arising. The Pequots and the Mohegans began aligning themselves differently. The Pequot aligned with the Dutch, the Mohegans with the English. There was a demand for land in Pequot-controlled areas, such as Massachusetts and Connecticut. The areas in question were important because they controlled access to the Connecticut River and the rich river valley. That land is valuable, right? It's valuable for planting. It's rich in resources, so they wanted that land. In 1634, there was a group of unknown natives who killed a slave hunter named John Stone of Massachusetts and 8 of his hunting companions. The Pequots then attacked settlers in Connecticut on Pequot land. The governor of Massachusetts then organized a military to push the indigenous people out. On May 26, 1637, under the lead of Captain John Mason, 90 men, along with 200 Mohegans and Narragansetts, decided to launch a surprise attack and then set fire to a Pequot settlement at Mystic River. It's also known as the Mystic River Massacre. Over 700 men, women, and children were killed. Connecticut laid claim to the Pequot land under rights of conquest. Think Manifest Destiny. Think, oh gosh, I forgot the name of it. Doctrine of Discovery. I was going to say, I forgot the name of it, but it eventually came to me. That is how they claimed this land. Losing men consistently eventually broke the spirit of the Pequot people. They decided to flee their lands and seek refuge in the west with the Mohawks. In mid-June, John Mason ended up catching up with those Pequots who were escaping and surrounded them in what is present-day Fairfield, Connecticut. He would allow a couple hundred to surrender, and this was mostly women and children. But he eventually caught up with 8 warriors and the leader of the Pequot at the time. And instead of, they were on their way to find refuge with the Mohawk, but instead they were killed. This was essentially the end of the Pequot War. Those who survived were sent to live with Mohegans or Narragansetts. Others were put on ships and sent to Bermuda as slaves. Many were made to work as servants in English homes in the colony. The colonies basically declared that the Pequots were now extinct and prohibited them from using their name or their language. And afterwards, they had a feast of Thanksgiving. And that is actually the origin of Thanksgiving. So when we think about Thanksgiving today, and I mean, I think it's great to have a day of Thanksgiving, right, to be thankful for. But 2 things I want you to think about that. Number 1, Thanksgiving falls in November, which is Native American Heritage Month. And the next day, the day after Thanksgiving, is Native American Heritage Day. So it's a way to celebrate Indigenous people, and I always think of it as it's a way to celebrate those of us who survived. And if you're looking to as a way to decolonize your Thanksgiving in a different sort of way, there are a lot of things you can do. Number 1, and the easiest thing I always tell people to do, is to just recognize the land that you're standing on, that you're feasting on, and think about that in a way. Also read books and spread the message of how Thanksgiving actually got its origins. Its more modern origins actually do happen during the Civil War, when Lincoln actually declares Thanksgiving a national holiday, because we're in the midst of fighting each other, and so he wanted to create a day of togetherness. But when we think about the actual true origins of Thanksgiving, it is because of the Pequot War, and it is also because of King Philip's War, which I don't talk about here, but it mirrors the Pequot War. So there's all of these things that are happening, right? There's this land that's being conquered. There are these people that are being killed. There are settlers coming in, and the numbers keep growing, right? And we know here in Michigan there are other things that are happening. If you've heard me speak here before, I've talked about Pontiac's Rebellion. That's something that's going on. There's the French and Indian War that happens, that ends in 1763. In 1763, you have Pontiac's Rebellion that happens. Also in 1763, you have the Proclamation Line, which is the crown telling settlers not to cross the Appalachian Mountains, right? Don't do that. Everything west of the Appalachian Mountains is Indian territory. That's where they get to settle. That's where they get to live. But there are a lot of other things going on too. And all of these things lead to the accumulation of what I really think that this year is actually about. And it's about the American Revolution, right? And so this is part of not only the timeline of the United States, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I'll be talking about it more later on, but I do think it's important to touch on a few things. So we jumped from 1638. We're jumping to 1765 because if we did every little thing, we would be here all night. But by 1760, this is important, by 1760, the population in the colonies reaches 1 million people. That is a lot of people, 1 million. In 1764, you have the Sugar Act. 1765, you have the Stamp Act. 1770 and 1773, you have the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. In 1774 and 1775, you have the First and then the Second Continental Congress meeting. It's at the Second Continental Congress where they establish Indian commissioners. So it's kind of the beginning of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so to speak. There are 3 departments in this department that are created. There's a Northern, Southern, and Middle. Benjamin Franklin is Indian Commissioner of the North. Patrick Henry is Indian Commissioner in the Middle. And James Wilson is Indian Commissioner in the South. Franklin tries to negotiate neutrality in the upcoming war with indigenous people by promising trade goods and blacksmith services. The offer is declined, but eventually some tribal nations do support the colonists. As I stated earlier, in 1777, the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, divide and eventually break apart over disagreements about who they should support during the American Revolution. The Mohawks support the Crown, the Onondaga and Seneca favor neutrality, and the Oneida and the Tuscarora side with the colonies. In 1778, the first U.S. Indian treaty was signed with the Lenape people. The treaty gave the Lenape the potential opportunity to send a representative to Congress in return for supporting the colonies against the British. While this clause was never implemented, it did put the idea of Indian representation in Congress, and that little clause has actually been worked into other treaties that were made between tribal nations and the United States. The treaty also recognized the mechanism as a primary legal instrument for federal policy towards Native people. And this first treaty between Native nations and the United States also recognizes the sovereignty of tribal nations, whether it meant to or not. Treaties are legal agreements made between sovereign entities, right? The United States has like a bajillion treaties with different countries and tribal nations. We honor the Treaty of Paris today still, which is the treaty that ended the American Revolution. We would never think of not honoring that. That would be ridiculous, right? But today I will tell you there are over 300 treaties between the United States and Native nations, and the United States has never upheld one. Not one. Not a one. We, as Indigenous people, have always held up our end of the bargain. As you can see, we no longer have our land, right? But the United States has never upheld theirs. And one of those treaties is the Treaty of Greenville, also known as the Treaty with the Wyandots. This is a treaty that was signed in 1795 between the United States and Indigenous people in what was the Northwest Territory after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The treaty was signed on August 3rd, 1795, and essentially ended the Northwest Indian War in Ohio and determined that Indian country would be confined to the northwestern part of Ohio. That was supposed to be Indian country, Indian territory. We know that doesn't stay the same. We know eventually Indian territory becomes like Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and then we know it becomes just Kansas and Oklahoma, and then we know it becomes just Oklahoma, and now we know it doesn't exist anymore. So they're making this northwest part of Ohio Indian country. Those involved in the treaty were General Anthony Wayne, William Wells, future President William Henry Harrison, William Clark, and Meriwether Lewis. Lewis and Clark. The tribes involved were the Wyandot, the Lenape, the Shawnee, the Ojawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Kickapoo. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the British agreed to withdraw their forts from the area. The treaty was meant to extinguish the Indian title to the lands they had, which was about 2/3 present-day Ohio, a section of Indiana, and the sites of present-day Detroit, Chicago, and Peoria. The treaty also fixed a permanent line between native lands and lands open for settlement, which would start at the mouth of the Cayuga River in present-day Cleveland and run south along the river until it hits the portage between Cuyahoga and the lakes, the Portage Lakes, area between Akron and Canton. It continues to reach Fort Lauren in present-day Bolivar. Then the line runs west/southwest to Fort Laramie on the Great Miami River. Then it ran north-northwest to Fort Recovery on the Wabash River near the present-day border between Ohio and Indiana. And from there, the line ran south-southwest to the Ohio River at the point opposite of the mouth of the Kentucky River in present-day Carrollton, Kentucky. The map kind of shows, where everything was going. On the instructions from the War Department, General Anthony Wayne had all 1,100 chiefs sign the treaty individually. The Allied tribes gave up lands, but were also promised lands with a clear boundary and a promise that while settlement wouldn't happen, that settlement wouldn't happen on their new lands. We know that didn't stay very long. Acting on orders from Thomas Jefferson, William Henry Harrison, who had been appointed governor of the Northwest Territory, violated the treaty almost immediately after it was signed. As with any treaty, lands were being encroached upon by white settlers, violating the agreements. An upset Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, would lead a group of indigenous people into forming their own confederacy to regain their land. It would all come to a head at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, so just before the War of 1812, where they would lose overwhelmingly, and this is said to have driven the tribes to support the British during the War of 1812. So tribes that supported the colonists during the American Revolution flipped sides in the War of 1812, just like tribes who supported British during the French and Indian War. It flips during the American Revolution. It flips again this time. After the War of 1812, Native tribes were continuously moved westward to Indian country west of the Mississippi. By 1840, the old Northwest Territory was essentially cleared of any indigenous presence. And so that gets us to 1820, where the population in the United States is now 20 million people. So from 1760, where it's a million, to 1820, it's now 20 million. Where are we going to put all these people? What are we going to do? Like, we have to figure out a way to have these people be able to be settled somewhere.
Where did they all come from?
The settlers?
Yeah, the 20 million.
Oh, people who were here. I can get more into that at the end, but it was people who were already here, families being born. People are still coming over, right? People are still coming to the, quote, New World. They want to come to the United States. And so by 1820, again, it reaches 20 million people, but you've still got the original inhabitants of this land here, settled on their home territories. What are we going to do with them? This leads to something called the Indian Removal Act, which is just had its anniversary. It was signed May 28th, 1830, by President Andrew Jackson. 2 years ago now, I was down at the Hermitage in Nashville, which is Andrew Jackson's plantation home, and I talked about Indian removal at that. I did a talk down there at the home, and I was a little concerned how it was going to be received because I once gave a talk about Custer in Monroe, and that didn't go very well. So I was like, what are they going to do if I'm going to come in and talk about Jackson, the way I talked about him? It was very well received. I was like, oh, yes. Yay, Tennessee, yay, people who are wanting to learn more. So as if you couldn't tell, he's not my favorite person, Andrew Jackson. It's interesting. And he is part of some research that I'm working on. But on May 28th, 1830, he signs the Indian Removal Act. What does the Indian Removal Act do? It authorizes the president to grant unsettled lands to indigenous folks west of the Mississippi in exchange for lands within existing state borders. There was a period of time where there was voluntary migration, but only a few folks from a few tribes moved. So we have the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminole. The Seminoles were coerced into signing a removal treaty. They refused to leave, though many of them, and this leads to the Second Seminole War. The Creeks refused to leave, but they signed a treaty that would guarantee them protector rights over their land, but it didn't protect them from land speculators. In 1836, the Creeks were forcibly moved from their homelands. The Chickasaw saw that this was inevitable. They were going to be forcibly removed, and they didn't resist. They signed a treaty with the federal government for suitable land in the West and protection until they moved. However, the encroachment of white settlement became too much for the federal government to handle, so they say, and they backed out of the treaty. And the Chickasaw were forced to pay the Choctaws to live on part of their allotment. The Cherokee were like, we're going to go a different route. So in 1831, they took their case to the Supreme Court in a case called Wooster v. Georgia, where they used a Georgia law that stated white settlers couldn't live on Indian land without written permission from the state. the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, stating that they had the right to self-government. And yeah, that law on the books in Georgia, that stands. But the state and President Jackson refused to uphold the decision of the Supreme Court. So the Cherokee, even after winning their Supreme Court case, signed a treaty, and that became the Treaty of New Echota. Jackson obtained the signature of a Cherokee chief agreeing to relocation. The Cherokee were given 2 years to voluntarily move. By 1838, 16,000 remained on their land and refused to move. So Jackson sent in 7,000 armed U.S. military troops to make the Cherokee move at gunpoint. They were not allowed to gather their belongings. What they had on them was all that they had. Their homes were looted by white settlers as they were herded into corrals and then marched off to Oklahoma. This was known as the Trail of Tears, and along the way, 4,000 indigenous people died of disease, cold, and hunger along that route. By 1840s, with the exception of a small band of Seminoles, no tribes resided in the South from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Because of the Indian Removal Act, a total of 50,000 indigenous people were moved off their lands, and it opened 25 million acres of land to white settlers and the spread of slavery. In 1836, shortly after the Cherokee were moved, Arkansas became a state. By 1860, the total population in the United States reached 60 million people. Moving was inevitable. And this map is one that I absolutely love. And when it goes back to the beginning, you'll notice that it doesn't even start pre-colonization, right? It already has the 13 colonies already marked out. So it starts, I think, about 1794. And it goes and it shows what happened throughout history with the removal of indigenous people from their lands. And it ends with a pretty accurate representation of reservations today. And again, by 1860, the population within the United States reaches 60 million people, right? So all of the events that I've talked about tonight lead up to what Jackson does in 1830, which is signing of the Indian Removal Act. There is a part 2 to this talk where we go from 1860 to 1924. And so what do we talk about in that? We talk about the Dakota Uprising in 1862 that happens during the Civil War. We talk about Wounded Knee. We talk about the other Indian Wars. And we talk about in 1924, so 2 years ago, would have been 100 years in 2024, where indigenous people received citizenship to the land that they were born on, in the country that they were born in. My grandfather was 11 by the time the United States said, "You're a citizen of the United States." He was 11. So when he was born, the United States didn't think he was a citizen. So I think it's really important to talk about these important pieces of history and topics. I also like to leave people with a little bit, the educator in me likes to leave people with homework. So all of these are books. So Indigenous Peoples, History of the United States, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, By the Fire We Carry, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, The Rediscovery of America are all books. Rediscovery of America and By the Fire We Carry are probably my 2 top favorites, followed very closely by The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. But The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk really talks about very timely events. And it really goes back to the founding, but really gives us the indigenous perspective. The Library of Congress website has a lot of great maps that you can look at to find more information about what the lands looked like. And you can also see maps of tribal reservations, which is really interesting. 100 Years is kind of really, to me, it's an uplifting documentary, but it's about Eloise Cobell, who was the treasurer for the Blackfeet tribe in Montana, and she discovered some discrepancies that were happening, and this is recent history, by the way. She discovered some discrepancies that were happening off land leases and was able to sue the government, basically the federal government, and win billions of dollars for her tribe, which were turned into scholarships that students for Blackfeet can apply for and go to college. So it actually is really good. It's a really good documentary. And then Trudell is also another documentary. It's about John Trudell, who's a poet, artist, activist. He was Lakota, and he was very instrumental in the American Indian movement. He actually participated in the occupation at Alcatraz in end of the 1960s. So that's also a very good documentary. Both of those, last time I watched them, I could get them on Netflix. I have not looked to see where you could stream them, but I'm sure you can find them on whatever streaming service you might have, or YouTube for free, obviously. But with that, we spanned a lot of history, right? We went from about 1142 to 1860 in about 40-ish minutes, so that's not bad. I once did a whole talk on federal Indian policy in 15, so this was like a piece of cake. So we have time for a few questions, so if anyone has any questions, Marissa has a microphone, she'll come up to you. And yeah, we can take like just a few questions.
My question is, were you able to do any research on the Potawatomi band, the Huron band of the Potawatomis? I understand that they occupied approximately 1/3 or more of the state of Michigan before the Indian Removal Act. And that's the Huron River right here.
Yeah, I have done some research on them. I don't have my notes in front of me, so I don't want to give you inaccurate information, but they have been a tribe that I've looked at. I'm really starting to narrow in my focus on more Great Lakes tribal nations, so maybe when I get all of that ready, I'll come back here and do another talk about them.
I was most interested in this because there's a woman who's a Native American who goes to our church and also is a researcher with U of M. And the research was done by the Kalamazoo Library, some of it by the Ypsilanti Library, and they were able to pull up the 1830 Indian Removal Act, but they also pulled up other information showing that the people didn't get removed, they hid in the forest, they ran, they hid, and they came back, and there is tribal land on the western side of the state of Michigan now, I understand, which is after losing 1/3 or more of the state of Michigan, they have 120 acres, something, and they have tribal government. They have a tribal council. They're not under the government of the state or of the federal. And so some of them have reestablished schools, reestablished their culture, but can you imagine being shrunk to 120 acres from 1/3 of the state of Michigan? This is not right.
No, I agree with you. It's absolutely not right. Another example I'll give you is the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin currently have, I think their reservation is just over 200,000 acres, where they originally inhabited from the tippy top of the Upper Peninsula all the way down to Chicago. It's like over 80 million acres of land. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, though. Any other questions? Comments, concerns, what you're having for dinner? Where you're going tomorrow?
Before 1924, you mentioned the Native people could become citizens of America. Prior to 1924, were Native peoples allowed to vote in the American system?
No. Indigenous people didn't fully have the right to vote until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. So, yep. But great question. It's a very timely question, considering we just had the Supreme Court got another portion of the Voting Rights Act in Louisiana versus Calais. So I just did a project. I was just working on a project at work for the past 2.5 years about voting rights. That's literally in my brain all the time. Any other questions? Comments? Yeah, we'll do this last one here.
What are your thoughts on the theory that those from the Lost Colony might have assimilated with other native tribes.
Yeah, I've heard that theory before. That is interesting because I don't know what exactly my thoughts are, other than I know, so there was a tribe in North Carolina that just got federal recognition, the Lumbee tribe, which they're on the eastern side of the state. And so some people have argued that they are the descendants of the Lost Colony of Roanoke and the tribal nations in the area. And they looked at different characteristics that people have, so like colored hair, like colored eyes, things like that. I think it's possible that, they just were like, you know what, it's been 3 years, we're really tired of waiting on these folks to come back from England. These folks over here know how to do things and they can teach us. To me, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility, considering that we also do know, particularly with the French, not so much with the British, so this would be an outlier, but particularly with the French, when the French would come over, they weren't bringing their wives or children or families. They were integrating themselves into the tribal nations, right? So they were marrying indigenous women, they were having children, they were really becoming part of community. So I'm like, there is precedent for it. So yeah, I don't know. That's really interesting. I really hope in my lifetime we figure out what happened to the Lost Colony, because every now and then I go down a rabbit hole and I'm like, my husband has to pull me back. He's like, come back. But it is really interesting to think about, right? It's one of those, you're sitting in 4th and 5th grade and you're like, what happened to these people? Where'd they go? So yeah, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I just don't know if there's enough evidence to prove it. But yeah. But thank you guys so much. I appreciate you coming out, and don't forget to come out on June 30th and hear how Indigenous people played a role in the American Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.